Alright, mandatory voting. Everyone is hot and steamy over mandatory voting. What is mandatory voting? Mandatory or compulsory voting is being forced by law to participate in polls and voting. And if you don't, you generally get a fine. So what people are all hot and steamy about is if countries should enforce mandatory voting, if it's beneficial, what the pros and cons of it are. And basically, okay, so there's a few different ways you could shed light on mandatory voting. But personally, I think that it's beneficial that countries especially the U.S., with such a low voter turnout, could benefit from it. Because, forcing people to vote gives you a higher voter turnout. And with that comes, a better understanding of what everyone in the country is looking for. Instead of just the certain population who decides to vote, you're getting everyone. Another benefit of mandatory voting is it's better for campaigns and when people are running for office or some kind of position such as that. Because when citizens are required to vote, they don't have to, or the campaigns don't have to try to coax the voters who are undecided or don't plan on voting. They don't have to try to coax them to go to the polls or the booths. So they spend less money and time on that. And there's also a lot less attack advertising. Okay, so some statistics for mandatory voting. Here's a chart of different countries and their voter turnouts. In Australia, right here, is at 95%. 95% of the constituents who can vote do vote. America is only at 42, which is relatively surprising considering we pride ourselves on the right to vote. But I don't know, a lot of people just don't exercise that. Alright, so while we're on graphics, I figured I'd show this one. It says, basically it's a line of people who just have complaints about the government and how it's run and what they, how the government doesn't understand them. And then underneath it, there is the voting office and how there's no one there. Not maybe because they're uninformed or it just doesn't cross their mind that they can vote to make a difference, to change politics and government. And that's the best way to make your voice heard, but they're just not. They just don't do it. So if compulsory voting was enforced, though, then it'd be a lot easier for the citizens to voice their opinions and for everyone to, get across what they're trying to about the government or just views in general. So there's a few pretty good ways you can oppose mandatory voting. And one of the strongest viewpoints against it is it's called donkey votes. What that is the donkey votes are the people who just don't really care about the issue, or they just feel forced to vote, so they just vote randomly with they're just ignorant about it, and they just go in blindly and just with no real knowledge about it, so they just cast a random vote. So another point you can take against mandatory voting is because the one the uninformed voters, and another one is required a database. So for people to to figure out who didn't vote after an election, to go around and figure that out and then issue fines and whatnot, cost a lot of time and money. So that's another reason against it. So another thing people who are against mandatory voting like to argue is that it's a restriction that being compulsory is a restriction, and it's making them vote, and how that's kind of unconstitutional, or how that wouldn't be in a democracy. But the fact is that that's just one thing that's like the only one that people really bring up a whole lot, as compared to you have to, other things are compulsory too, you have to be on jury duty, or you have to sign up for the draft and things like that. But that's kind of overlooked as compared to the mandatory voting. But things like that, um, there's just not really. I don't know. The mandatory voting seems kind of like a pretty small thing to complain about, when it's a right given to you. So to complain about having to vote would be kind of somewhat ridiculous. So that's my take on compulsory voting.